In the isolated mountains of Tennessee, between deep valleys and dense forests, communities developed customs as disturbing as the isolation that itself surrounded them. This is the history of the Caldwell family, whose marriage practices created one of the most genetically committed lineages ever documented in the southern United States. The year was 1912. While the world watched the wreck of the Titanic and President William Howard Taft led his campaign for re-election, a way of life completely oblivious to modernity unfolded in the mountains. Hidden between the valleys, the Caldwells held a tradition dating back generations. The family's women were intended to unite with multiple men of the same clan, creating a web of consanguineous relationships that challenged all social and biological norms. At just 16 years old, Evelina Caldwell became the protagonist of this obscure chapter of American history. Born in a rustic cabin in Hancock County, she grew up without any contact with the outside world. She was educated only in housework and the peculiar doctrines that her grandfather, Silas Caldwell, imposed as absolute law. Silas, the patriarch, was a 67-year-old man whose wrinkled face and severe look revealed both years of hard work and a distorted moral intelligence. With a gray beard that reached his chest and hands calloused from working the earth, he ruled his family with unquestionable authority. His justification for the practice of consanguinity was as simple as it was disturbing. The blood of the Caldwell must remain pure, without mixtures. What is born on the mountain belongs to the mountain. The family's properties stretched for about 200 acres of mountainous land, with 6 rustic huts connected by dirt trails. There lived approximately 30 family members, all descendants of Silas and his late wife, Sarah. The isolation was not only geographical but also ideological. Children did not attend school, and contact with strangers was strictly forbidden. Tradition established that, upon reaching the appropriate age, Caldwell women should first join the older men in the family other than their direct father, usually an uncle or first-degree cousin. Then, progressively, they would become wives of other men in the family, in a hierarchy determined by age and position within the clan. The consequences of this practice were evident in the faces of the younger ones. Children born from these unions often had visible physical deformities, prominent jaws, low foreheads, eyes set too close together, crooked fingers, and significant intellectual deficiencies. When it came to Evelina, the young, light brown-haired girl with melancholy eyes had a limited understanding of what her family duty meant. Her mother, Martha, had been through the same ritual and now, at 35, looked like a woman of 60, consumed by hard work and multiple pregnancies. Martha had given birth to 8 children, of which only 3 survived, Evelina and her 2 younger brothers, both showing clear signs of cognitive disabilities. The first husband designated for Evelina was her uncle, Ezekiel, her father's brother, a 45-year-old man with a violent temperament and precarious hygiene habits. The ceremony, if it could be called that, happened on a full moon night with all family members gathered around a fire. Silas, as patriarch, led the ritual based on a distortion of biblical scriptures and invented traditions, legitimizing what any external society would consider a violation. Evelina did not shed a tear during the ritual. Her face, illuminated by the fire, showed a resignation that went beyond her years, the same empty look she had observed in her mother's and aunt's eyes. Inside Ezekiel's cabin, where she would now be forced to live, there was only a straw bed, a rustic table, and a few chairs. The walls, made of poorly adjusted trunks, let the cold wind in through the cracks. What no one knew at that moment was that, unlike other women in the family, Evelina had had a brief contact with the outside world. 2 years earlier, during a rare trip to the nearest city to sell farm products, she had talked to a local teacher who, realizing her situation, had secretly given her a book. For months, Evelina had learned to read in hiding, absorbing ideas that showed her a reality beyond the mountains. While the other family members celebrated with homemade liquor, Evelina kept a seed of resistance within herself. Under the straw mattress, hidden in a cloth bag, was the book that had changed her perspective, a collection of stories about women who had challenged the conventions of their times. On the horizon, clouds accumulated, foreshadowing a storm. The cold wind descending from the mountains carried the smell of rain and the distant sound of thunder. It was as if nature itself reflected the inner whirlwind of Evelina. What no one could predict was that this young woman would trigger events that would eventually expose the Caldwells' practices to the outside world, leading to the disintegration of generations of isolation and consanguinity. Check it out if you are already subscribed to this channel. You need to know these real stories that reveal the darkest secrets of humanity. Stories that no one else has the courage to tell, but we all need to know. Evelina's first weeks in Ezekiel's cabin established a pattern she feared would last for the rest of her life. Wake up before dawn, prepare breakfast, work in the garden, wash clothes in the nearby stream, cook, clean, and obey the demands of her husband when he returned from long hours of hunting or work in the illegal still hidden in the property's caves. Ezekiel was not a man given to conversations. With almost 3 decades more than Evelina, he treated her as an acquired property, not very different from the tools he used to cultivate the land or the animals he kept in the small corral behind the cabin. His face, perpetually burned by the sun, and his calloused hands revealed a life of hard work. But his eyes, too small a common feature in the family, held a coldness that made Evelina tremble. During this period, Evelina carefully observed the patterns and routines of the family. The Caldwell women, although subjugated, had established a silent system of communication and mutual support. At times when they gathered to wash clothes in the stream or tend vegetables in the communal gardens, they exchanged significant looks and hasty whispers, sharing small survival strategies. Evelina's aunt, Judith, a 42-year-old woman whose curved body and prematurely aged face told a story of a life of deprivation, became her reluctant confidant. On an October afternoon, as they collected apples in the small orchard, Judith explained in a low voice the reality Evelina would have to face. After Ezekiel, Jeremiah's shift will come. And after Jeremiah, the young Isaac, when he turns 18 in the spring, explained Judith, her eyes constantly vigilant to ensure they were not being observed. That's how it works here. Grandfather Silas says that this way the blood stays strong, but look at the children, look at my children. Judith had 4 living children from different family husbands. The oldest, a 15-year-old boy named Eli, could barely speak and had difficulty performing the simplest tasks. His asymmetrical face, with one eye visibly larger than the other and a misaligned jaw, was a silent testimony to the effects of continued consanguinity. Silas does not allow us to see anything wrong, continued Judith. He says that the children's difficulties are trials sent by God, not the result of our family arrangements. It was at this moment that Evelina decided to share her secret with Judith. That night, when Ezekiel was at a meeting with other family men at the still, Evelina showed her aunt the hidden book and revealed that she knew how to read. There is a world out there, whispered Evelina to Aunt Judith, the pages of the book illuminated by the weak light of a candle. A world where women are not forced to marry their own relatives, where children go to school and are not born as they are born here. The winter from 1912 to 1913 was particularly severe in the mountains. The snow further isolated the Caldwell property, making the already rare trips to the city completely impossible. Inside the cabins, illuminated only by fireplaces and tallow candles, the family survived on foods preserved during the fall: smoked meat, pickled vegetables, cornmeal, and apples stored in the basement. It was during this winter that Evelina discovered she was expecting a child. The news, which in other circumstances could have brought joy, filled her with a deep terror. She had seen children born in the family, many did not survive the early months, and those who did often had serious problems. Cradling her still flat belly, Evelina made a decision: she needed to escape before her child was born into that environment. The plan began to take shape during the long winter nights. With Judith's reluctant help, Evelina began storing small amounts of food, hiding them in a hole under the cabin's floor. She also separated some pieces of clothing and, more importantly, began to study the rudimentary maps drawn in the book she had, trying to understand how she could navigate the mountains to the nearest city. The biggest challenge would be avoiding recapture. The Caldwell family had connections with other isolated mountain communities, and Silas had made it clear over the years that desertions would not be tolerated. Whispered stories among the women spoke of previous escape attempts that had ended in tragedy. The opportunity arose in the early spring of 1913, with the melting of the snow. The men of the family organized a 3-day hunting expedition to refill the nearly empty pantry after the long winter. All the women were left on the property with strict orders to prepare the gardens for planting. On the morning of the men's departure, Evelina embraced Judith in a silent goodbye. The aunt, with tears in her eyes, pressed a small package into her niece's hands, some coins saved over years, hidden in a flap of fabric. "Go to the east," instructed Judith, following the stream's course. "After 2 days of walking, you will arrive in Rogersville. Look for the Methodist church. The pastor there is a good man. He will help you." That night, under the protective cloak of darkness and with only the crescent moonlight to guide her, Evelina Caldwell left behind the only life she had known. Carrying a small bundle with food, some clothes, her precious book, and the coins given by Judith, she entered the forest, following the stream's course as instructed. What she did not know was that her escape would trigger a series of events that would eventually lead to the complete exposure of the Caldwell family's practices, resulting in one of the first documented investigations into consanguinity in the isolated communities of Appalachia. Her 3-day mountain journey would only be the beginning of a much greater transformation, not just of her own life, but of the lives of all the women and children she left behind. As she walked through the dark forest, her hand instinctively over her belly where a new life grew, Evelina felt something she had not experienced for years: hope. Evelina's trip through the mountains was harder than she could have imagined. Used only to the Caldwell's immediate surroundings, she found the world beyond was simultaneously wider and more dangerous than her books had suggested. During the 2nd day of her journey, a heavy rain soaked her and ruined her provisions. Hunger and exhaustion dominating her body, Evelina found shelter under a rocky protrusion. It was there, shaking as she tried to light a small fire, that she experienced her first moment of true despair. "What if it's better if I come back?" she whispered to herself, her protective hands on her belly. "What if we die here in the mountains?" The thought of returning to Ezekiel's cabin, of submitting again to the system she had fled, caused a chill to go through her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. No, she decided firmly. Any destination would be preferable to that one. With renewed determination, Evelina continued her journey as soon as the rain decreased. At dusk on the 3rd day, exhausted and hungry, she finally spotted the first houses of Rogersville. The small town, with its dirt streets and modest buildings, looked like a metropolitan center compared to the isolation in which she had lived. With dirty and torn clothes, tangled hair, and bare feet bleeding from cuts suffered during the walk, Evelina attracted looks of distrust and pity as she headed to the city center, looking for the Methodist church Judith had mentioned. The church was a simple white-painted wood building with a modest belfry and a small cemetery next door. As Evelina approached the door, her legs finally gave in to tiredness, and she fell to her knees on the entrance steps. This is how Reverend Thomas Wilson found her, a pregnant young woman, semi-conscious from exhaustion, murmuring incoherently about escaping the Caldwells. The Reverend, a middle-aged man with grey hair and kind eyes behind round glasses, didn't need much explanation. He had heard rumors about the isolated families in the mountains and their peculiar practices, although the complete extent of what happened remained a mystery to most of the town's inhabitants. "My wife will take care of you," he said kindly as he helped Evelina enter the parish house adjacent to the church. "You're safe now." Martha Wilson, the Reverend's wife, was a practical woman with experience in nursing. She treated Evelina's injuries, fed her hot soup, and set her in a clean bed, simple luxuries the young woman had not experienced for years, if ever. In the following days, as she recovered her strength, Evelina gradually told her story to the Wilsons. The couple heard with increasing horror the details of life on the Caldwell property: forced unions among close relatives, children born with disabilities, the absolute control exerted by the patriarch Silas. "What you call marriage is not recognized by the law," explained Reverend Wilson carefully. "What was done to you and the other women is considered a crime in this state." The idea that the practices she had known all her life were not only morally questionable but illegal was revealing to Evelina. For the first time, she truly processed the abnormality of the life she had left behind. If you are feeling your stomach turn with this story, leave in the comments justice for Evelina. It is important that stories like these are known so that such atrocities never happen again. Meanwhile, on the Caldwell property, the return of the men from the hunting expedition had triggered a crisis. Evelina's absence was immediately noted, and Ezekiel, humiliated and enraged by the desertion of his young wife, demanded retribution. Silas, the patriarch, organized a search of the property and surroundings, but Evelina's trail had already been erased by the rain. It was Judith who, risking her own safety, suggested that Evelina had probably died in the forest, taken by hunger or wild animals. The suggestion, although macabre, temporarily satisfied the fury of the men, who soon turned their attention to more pressing issues, such as preparing the earth for spring planting. In Rogersville, as the weeks passed, Evelina's presence in the parish house began to generate curiosity in the small community. Reverend Wilson, concerned about the possibility that the Caldwells might eventually discover her whereabouts, contacted a friend in Knoxville, a doctor named Dr. James Harrington, who was interested in consanguinity studies and their effects. Dr. Harrington arrived in Rogersville on a May afternoon, bringing with him medical equipment and a sharp scientific interest in Evelina's history. As one of the first doctors in Tennessee to formally study the genetic effects of consanguineous unions, he saw in the fugitive young woman an opportunity to document a case that until then existed mainly in medical theory. What you describe, he explained to Evelina during his initial exam, is an extreme endogamy system, far beyond what is usually seen even in isolated communities. The fact that multiple men of the same lineage, joining the same women, exponentially increases the risks to the offspring. Examining Evelina carefully, Dr. Harrington noticed subtle characteristics that suggested generations of consanguinity: a slightly shorter stature than normal, a specific curvature on the jawline, and a particular eye spacing. Although Evelina was one of the fortunate ones with no serious problems, the signs were there for trained eyes. "Your baby," he said cautiously, "is at significant risk. I can't predict for sure, but modern science suggests that children born from unions this close often develop serious complications." The news, though not completely unexpected, devastated Evelina. Cradling her now visibly protruding belly, she wondered what kind of life she could offer a child who would potentially face challenges from birth. It was Martha Wilson who comforted her that night, sitting on the edge of her bed while silent tears ran down the young woman's face. "You have already shown more courage than most people demonstrate in a lifetime," said Martha, holding Evelina's hand. "Regardless of what happens, you won't be alone." In June 1913, with her advanced state of pregnancy making it impossible to hide her presence, the story of Evelina reached the ears of the local sheriff. Concerned about the legal implications and the possibility of retaliation from the Caldwells, Sheriff Thomas Jenkins made a formal visit to the parish house. "Reverend," he said, removing his hat as he entered, "I've heard disturbing rumors about a sheltered young woman here, fleeing a situation unusual in the mountains." What followed was a long conversation in which Evelina, with the support of Reverend Wilson and Dr. Harrington, reported her experience. The sheriff, a man of rigid but righteous principles, was visibly disturbed by the account. "Miss Caldwell," he said finally, "what you describe are serious crimes according to Tennessee laws. If you are willing to give a formal testimony, I can start an investigation." The decision Evelina faced was monumental. Officially denouncing the family practices would mean not only exposing Silas and the other men but also bringing unwanted attention to the women and children she had left behind. On the other hand, remaining silent would mean allowing the cycle to continue indefinitely. That night, alone in her room in the parish house, Evelina opened her worn book, The Spark That Had Lit Her Journey to Freedom. Among its pages, she found the courage she needed in the stories of women who had changed not only their own lives but the lives of others around them. The next morning, with a firm hand on a Bible in the sheriff's office, Evelina Caldwell made her formal testimony. What she did not know was that her words would begin one of the first official investigations into forced consanguinity in the United States, eventually leading to changes in state laws on marriage and child protection. As summer advanced and her delivery date approached, Evelina alternated between moments of fierce determination and absolute terror. The future, previously so rigidly defined by the limits of the Caldwell property, now opened before her, vast, uncertain, and, despite all the challenges, finally hers to determine. One muggy morning in July 1913, Evelina's labor began. Martha Wilson, with her experience as an informal community midwife, prepared the back room of the parish house with hot water, clean towels, and the medicinal herbs she used to relieve childbirth. Dr. Harrington, who had extended his stay in Rogersville specifically to accompany the birth, arrived shortly after the first signs, bringing his medical suitcase and a countenance of professional concern. The labor was long and difficult. For over 20 hours, Evelina fought through increasingly intense contractions, her young and relatively healthy body working to bring into the world a child whose destiny was marked by generations of choices that were not hers. "You're doing very well," encouraged Martha, wiping the sweat from Evelina's forehead with a damp cloth. "Take a deep breath as I showed you." In the early hours of the next morning, with the first rays of sunshine filtering through the lace curtains, a girl was born with a surprisingly strong cry that filled the room. Dr. Harrington immediately examined her, his experienced eyes looking for the signs he feared. The relief on his face was visible when he finally wrapped the newborn in a clean blanket and handed her to Evelina. "She looks healthy," he said, allowing himself a rare smile. "We will need to observe her carefully in the coming months. But for now, you have a strong daughter." Evelina looked at the small, red, wrinkled face, feeling a wave of protective love so intense it almost took her breath away. The baby's eyes, though still unfocused, seemed to look straight at her with an intensity that made her heart squeeze. "Hope," whispered Evelina, gently touching her daughter's soft cheek. "Your name will be Hope." The choice of name was not accidental. Hope represented everything Evelina had risked her life to find and everything she wanted for her daughter's future. While mother and daughter rested, the world beyond the parish house walls continued to move. The investigation begun by Evelina's testimony had grown in scope and urgency. Sheriff Jenkins, initially skeptical of the extent of the allegations, had gathered enough evidence to justify a larger operation involving county officials and even a representative from the state prosecutor's office. One August morning, when Hope was only 3 weeks old, a delegation of 5 armed men led by the sheriff left for the mountains where the Caldwell property was located. Their mission was double: to investigate the allegations of forced and illegal unions, and to verify the well-being of the women and children who still lived under Silas's control. What they found exceeded Evelina's descriptions. The property, seen in the light of the official investigation, was revealed as a microcosm of misery and degradation. Precariously built and deteriorating cabins housed women with empty looks and children with visible deformities. Silas's maintained records, a bizarre combination of family tree and lineage control that resembled animal breeding more than human relations, provided irrefutable evidence of the forced consanguinity system that had persisted for at least 4 generations. Silas Caldwell, confronted by official authorities for the first time in his long life as patriarch, reacted with a mixture of religious outrage and incoherent threats. When the sheriff presented the arrest warrant, the old man tried to resist, only to be quickly subdued. "What we do here is sacred," he shouted as he was driven from the property. "The blood must remain pure. You have no right to interfere with God's laws." Ezekiel and the other adult men in the family were also detained, accused of various crimes from illegal relations to child abuse. The women and children, many seeing people from outside the family for the first time, were temporarily allocated to a makeshift shelter in the city while the authorities determined the next steps. The news of the Caldwell family and its practices soon spread beyond Rogersville. Newspapers in Knoxville and even Nashville published sensational reports about the colony of consanguinity discovered in the Tennessee mountains. The case quickly became a point of discussion for social reformers, doctors interested in genetics, and legislators concerned with gaps in existing laws. For Evelina, now established in a small room at the back of a general goods store where she had gotten a job as a helper, the attention was simultaneously validating and disturbing. On one hand, the public exposure meant the authorities could not simply ignore the situation. On the other hand, sensational reports often portrayed all the Caldwells, including the women and children, as mountain degenerates, ignoring the complex reality of victims and perpetrators. "They treat us as animals on display," commented Evelina bitterly to Martha Wilson during one of her weekly visits, while cradling Hope in her arms. "The same people who pretended not to see what happened in the mountains for decades now want to examine our lives as if we were specimens in a laboratory." The trial of Silas Caldwell and the other family men began in October 1913. The county court was packed beyond capacity. The curious from neighboring cities traveled hours to witness what the newspapers called the Mountain Judgment. Evelina, convened as the main witness for the prosecution, faced her biggest challenge yet. Dressed in a simple blue dress borrowed from Martha, she walked to the witness stand with her eyes fixed ahead, refusing to look to the side where Silas, Ezekiel, and the other men were sitting. When she finally lifted her eyes, she found Silas's gaze a look not of regret or shame, but of pure fury. The silent message was clear: she had betrayed her family, exposed its secrets, challenged his authority. For 4 hours, Evelina answered the prosecutor's questions and then endured the hostile interrogation of the defense attorney, a man hired by a local church that believed the case represented improper government interference in family affairs. "Miss Caldwell," asked the defense attorney, a thin man with a thin mustache and calculating eyes, "is it not true that you were never legally married to Ezekiel Caldwell? That in fact, there was no civil ceremony recognized by the state?" "There was no legal ceremony," answered Evelina firmly. "There was a ritual led by Silas based on his own interpretations of the scriptures. And you voluntarily participated in this ritual, correct?" Evelina felt a warmth from her neck to her cheeks. "I was 16. I was raised believing I had no choice. It was my duty." "Duty to whom, exactly?" "To the family. To the blood. As Silas always said." The lawyer smiled coldly. "And yet, when you decided that this duty no longer suited you, you simply fled. You abandoned your family." Before Evelina could answer, the prosecutor stood to protest. "Your Honor, the witness is a victim, not an accused." The judge, an elderly man with a face marked by deep wrinkles of expression, nodded. Protest sustained. The lawyer will restrict himself to the facts relevant to this case. Despite the hostile interrogation, Evelina's testimony, supported by the records found on the property and Dr. Harrington's medical reports on the conditions of the Caldwell children, was devastating to the defense. In late November, after 3 weeks of testimony, the jury returned with the verdict: guilty. Silas Caldwell was sentenced to 15 years in prison for multiple violations of state marriage laws and coercion. Ezekiel and the other men received sentences ranging from 5 to 10 years. The Caldwell women and children faced a different destiny. With the property confiscated by the state and without means of subsistence, they were temporarily allocated to various charities. The younger children, especially those with serious deficiencies, were sent to state institutions, a destiny that, although different from the mountain isolation, rarely offered much better conditions in America of the early 20th century. Judith, who had risked everything to help Evelina escape, eventually managed to settle on a small farm on the outskirts of Rogersville, where she worked as a washerwoman for local families. Her children, including Eli with his special needs, remained with her, a rare victory in a story marked by so many losses. For Evelina, the end of the trial brought temporary relief, but not the closure she had expected. The nights were still often interrupted by nightmares where she was back in Ezekiel's cabin, unable to escape. In the days, when she visited the market, she occasionally realized the eyes and whispers that followed her, a mixture of morbid curiosity and silent judgment. "You will always be that Caldwell girl," Martha Wilson had said kindly, but also with realism. "Not to us, but to many in this town. Perhaps it's time to consider a new beginning, somewhere where your name and your story do not precede you." The suggestion planted a seed in Evelina's mind. As hope grew, becoming a pink-cheeked girl with brown curls and a smile surprisingly free from any shadow of the past, Evelina began to consider possibilities beyond Rogersville. It was Dr. Harrington who finally offered the opportunity she needed. Having returned to Knoxville after the trial, he continued his study on the effects of consanguinity, now with a special interest in Hope's development. In one of his regular visits, he brought a proposal. The University of Tennessee is establishing a special program to study the genetic effects of various conditions, he explained. They need an administrative assistant, someone to organize files, transcribe notes, that kind of thing. It's not a glamorous job, but it pays reasonably well and comes with campus accommodations. Evelina, now 18 years old with her nearly 1-year-old daughter, saw in the offer more than a simple job. It was a chance to rebuild her life in an environment where her story, though not completely forgotten, would not be the only defining factor of her identity. In January 1914, with Hope in her arms and a small suitcase containing all her belongings, Evelina embarked on the train to Knoxville. Looking out the window as the mountain landscape slid away, she felt a complex mix of emotions. There was sadness for the women and children who could not escape, determination to build something better for her daughter, and a growing sense of purpose. What had begun as a simple escape was now turning into something bigger. The Caldwell case, though far from unique, had exposed a dark reality that many would rather ignore: the human consequences of generations of isolation and consanguinity in the remote communities of the Appalachians. The work Evelina would do at the university, although modest in scope, would contribute to an understanding that would eventually help prevent stories like hers. As the train gained speed, moving away from the shadows of the mountains toward the city's lights, Hope slept peacefully in her mother's arms. Her future, unlike so many Caldwell children before her, was not predetermined by an inescapable cycle of isolation and consanguinity. Whatever life reserved for her, Hope would have what her mother had risked everything to get: a choice. Knoxville, 1923 ***. A decade had passed since Evelina Caldwell had left the mountains with her newborn daughter. The city, while still modest by the standards of the great American metropolises, seemed a completely different world from the isolated slopes of the Appalachians. The University of Tennessee campus, with its red brick buildings and majestic oaks, had become home to Evelina and Hope. What had begun as a temporary position as an administrative assistant had evolved over the years. Evelina, demonstrating a keen intelligence and a thirst for knowledge that decades of isolation had not been able to suffocate, eventually gained a position as an assistant researcher in the Department of Social Studies. Hope, now 10, was a remarkably healthy and bright child, without any of the physical or cognitive signs that had marked so many Caldwell children. With wavy brown hair framing a lively and expressive face, she had inherited her mother's perceptive eyes but did not carry the shadow that often darkened Evelina's gaze. That specific afternoon, mother and daughter walked the campus, taking advantage of the warmth of the early fall. Hope, dressed in a simple blue dress and polished shoes, held her mother's hand while talking. "Mom," Hope asked, her clear voice cutting the afternoon air, "why does Dr. Harrington always examine me so carefully during our visits? I'm not sick." Evelina looked at her daughter, carefully considering her answer. Over the years, she had faced the question of how much and when to tell Hope about her origins. The girl knew only fragments: that her mother had come from the mountains, that her father was not part of their lives, that somehow they were special for Dr. Harrington's studies. Dr. Harrington is a scientist who studies how families pass traits from parents to children, Evelina explained, choosing her words carefully. You help him understand important things that can help other children. Hope considered this for a moment, her young face serious with contemplation. Is it because of my father? Because he was a relative of yours? Evelina stopped walking, feeling as if the air had been sucked from her lungs. In all the scenarios she had imagined for this conversation, she had never considered that Hope could have already deduced parts of the truth on her own. Where did you hear this?" she asked, her voice more shaky than she would like. Hope shrugged with the typical direct frankness of childhood. "I heard Dr. Harrington talking to Professor Wheeler about the Caldwell case and how I was a remarkable example of genetic resilience despite parental consanguinity. I looked the word up in the dictionary." Evelina felt a mixture of pride in her daughter's intelligence and despair for not being able to protect her from this truth longer. Guiding Hope to a bench under an oak, she sat down and pulled her daughter close. "There are parts of our story that I was hoping to share with you when you were older," Evelina started, "but you were always more insightful than I expected." In the following hours, sitting under the oak while the fall sun filtered through the golden leaves, Evelina told a simplified but honest version of her history. She talked about the Caldwell family in the mountains, how they lived isolated from the world, about traditions that forced relatives to marry each other, and her escape to give Hope a different life. Hope listened with an intensity that seemed beyond her years, occasionally asking surprisingly insightful questions. When Evelina ended, the girl remained silent for several long moments. "So that's why we don't have other relatives," she said finally. "And that's why you never wanted to go back to the mountains?" "Yes," answered Evelina gently. "But I want you to understand something very important. What happened doesn't define who you are. You're your own person, Hope. Always will be." Hope nodded slowly, processing everything she had heard. Then, in a movement that brought tears to Evelina's eyes, the girl leaned and hugged her mother firmly. "You are very brave, Mom," she whispered, "just like in the stories you read to me before bed." That conversation marked a turning point in the relationship between mother and daughter. With the secrets of the past now partially revealed, a new honesty flourished between them. Hope, with her natural curiosity now fed by fragments of her family history, began to ask more questions not just about the Caldwells, but about consanguinity, genetics, and the studies in which she and her mother had become an integral part. In 1925, when Hope was 12 years old, Evelina's work with Dr. Harrington culminated in a significant academic publication, Generational Effects of Continuous Consanguinity, a case study of Appalachia Star. The study, which maintained the anonymity of the subjects but detailed the genetic and social patterns observed in the Caldwell family and similar families, became an important reference in the emerging field of behavioral genetics. For Evelina, the publication represented a complete transformation from a silent victim to an active contributor to scientific knowledge that could eventually help prevent situations like the one she had faced. It was also during this period that Evelina received an unexpected letter from Rogersville. Martha Wilson, who had remained a faithful and regular correspondent over the years, wrote with news that reopened old wounds. Silas Caldwell had died in the state prison at the age of 80. "I thought you would like to know," wrote Martha, "that before his death, he asked to speak to a chaplain." No one knows what was said in that final conversation, but the chaplain later commented that even the hardest heart may eventually face its own truth. The news aroused in Evelina a storm of contradictory emotions. There was no forgiveness in her heart for the man who had perpetuated generations of suffering, but there was a strange sense of closure. The letter also featured news about other Caldwell women. Judith, who had remained in Rogersville, had established a small informal community for some of her family's ex-wives who had been able to rebuild their lives after the trial. Together, they operated a small laundry that had become a modest but stable business. "They talk about you often," wrote Martha. "For many of the younger women, you have become a kind of legend. The girl who escaped and changed everything. Some even send their daughters to school, inspired by what they heard about you and Hope." The idea that her escape had somehow opened the way for other women was simultaneously humbling and empowering for Evelina. The cycle that had seemed so unbreakable had been, if not completely broken, at least significantly weakened. In 1928, when Hope turned 15, the same age Evelina was when she started planning her escape, mother and daughter made an important decision. It was time to revisit the past, literally. The trip back to Rogersville, and eventually even the old Caldwell lands, was not easy. Each kilometer traveled by the train seemed to take Evelina more deeply into memories she had worked hard to subdue. But beside her was Hope, strong, confident, curious, a living memory that not all stories are condemned to repeat their darkest chapters. Martha Wilson, now a white-haired widow but with the same kind look, received them at the station. The reunion was emotional, with long hugs and tears that spoke more than words could express. "You have become a remarkable woman," said Martha, holding Evelina's face between her wrinkled hands. "And this must be Hope. My God, she has your eyes." The visit to Judith and the other Caldwell women was equally emotional. In a small converted house on the edge of the city, Evelina rediscovered women who had shared her childhood and youth, faces that carried the marks of time but also a new dignity that had been absent in the property days. "You paved the way," said Judith, now a middle-aged woman with grey hair and hands calloused by work. "After you fled, something changed. It was as if you had shown it was possible." The hardest part of the trip was the visit to the lands that once belonged to the Caldwells. Abandoned after the trial, the property was now partially covered by vegetation reclaiming the space where the cabins had been. Evelina walked slowly through what had been the center of the property, Hope respectfully a few steps back, stopping where Silas's main cabin had been. Evelina felt a tremor go through her body, not of fear or anger, but of a strange sense of liberation. "This place has no power over me anymore," she said finally, turning to look at her daughter. "Not over you, either. It never will." Hope, who had been quiet for most of the exploration, approached and took her mother's hand. "What happened here, it's part of our history, but it's not our future. On the trip back to Knoxville, sitting side by side on the train while the mountain landscape gradually gave way to the plains, Evelina reflected on the extraordinary journey she had traveled, not just the physical distance from the mountains to the university, but the transformation from a scared young woman without formal education into a woman who now contributed to scientific knowledge and social change. Most importantly, she looked at Hope, healthy, intelligent, with a bright future ahead of her, and saw the true measure of her victory against the Caldwells' marked cycle of consanguinity. In 1930, Hope Caldwell became the first of her lineage to enter the university, deciding to study medicine with a focus on genetics, a choice directly influenced by her own history. Evelina, now a respected researcher and occasional speaker on the social and medical effects of community isolation, watched with inexpressible pride as her daughter traced a path that would have been unthinkable 2 decades earlier. Evelina's work, combined with the studies of other researchers inspired by her case, eventually influenced changes in state laws on consanguineous marriage and the way authorities dealt with isolated communities. Instead of sensationalism or negligence, a new approach began to emerge, one that recognized the complexity of these situations and sought interventions that protected the vulnerable while respecting the dignity of all involved. On a fall afternoon in 1932, 20 years after her mountain escape, Evelina Caldwell was sitting in her university office reviewing notes for a lecture when she received an unexpected visit. A young woman, visibly nervous and carrying a small child, knocked shyly at her door. "Mrs. Caldwell," asked the hesitant visitor. "My name is Sarah. Sarah Jenkins. I came from a community in the Kentucky mountains. They told me you could help me." Looking at the young mother's anxious face, Evelina saw a reflection of herself 2 decades earlier, scared but determined to break a cycle that had trapped generations. With a kind smile, she invited Sarah to come in and sit. "You have already taken the first and hardest step," said Evelina, her voice calm and firm. "And yes, I can help you. We can help each other." As the fall sun cast a golden light through the office window, illuminating the hopeful face of the young mother and her son, Evelina felt a deep sense of purpose. The story of the Caldwells, her story, had not ended in the isolated mountains of Tennessee. It continued through every woman who found the courage to break cycles of abuse and isolation, through every child born with the opportunity to define their own destiny. The cruelest tradition of consanguinity had been broken, not just for one family, but potentially for many. And in this, Evelina Caldwell found her true liberation. Check it out if you are already subscribed to this channel. It is extremely important that stories like these are known so that we can protect future generations from practices that cause so much human suffering. If you watched so far, it is because you like this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so I can meet you and know who really likes the stories here on the channel. Do not forget to leave your like and share with someone who needs to know this obscure reality that existed in our society. Together we can guarantee that such practices remain only on the pages of history.